grief. We experience individual grief. Sometimes within just our family unit, we experience grief. There's some really interesting data that was done in Colorado Springs after those seasons of fires that we had. And it was interesting to consider as they started doing some kind of work with folks, the communal grief that our community experienced as a result of losing land and seeing so much destruction happen right there on our doorstep. You think about, there was the shooting at Club Q, just blocks away from my house. You bowl right next door. Maybe we weren't there in the club, but there's communal grief when there's destruction and loss in a community. We also experience grief within our own family units when somebody dies or we go through, just financial hardship. And then there's also just our own individual grief. Right? We relapse again, we make a mistake. We spend money we shouldn't have. We say something we shouldn't have said, and we grieve in our soul over something we've done. The first time I preached on grief here was right after COVID, and communally, right, there was a lot of grief that was experienced, whether it was loss of friendships over differing views on how COVID should have happened and how we should have handled it. People missed out on graduations and ceremonies and jobs, and sports wasn't the way it's used to be, and all sorts of things we lost. We all are experiencing grief one way or another. And grief is something that's layered. It's not something that's just, you can just speak into really clearly and say, this is exactly how it is for every single person, and this is how we all are to deal with it. There's layers and complexity to the grief that we experience. And while there is communal grief, the specific nature to the grief that we experience also can't be ignored. Yeah, we do experience things as community and as groups. Also, you are the only one that experiences grief in the particular way that you experience it. Which is why, for example, when you're going through something and somebody just gives you a whole bunch of advice and you're like, dog, like that is not working right now. They're saying, well, this is how I did it. This is what I went through. This is, yeah. And you're like, can you just listen to me? Because so often we neglect the specific nature of the grief that we're going through as well. So here's a little freebie here, is that when your family or friends, especially in immediate grief, when tragedy has just happened, that is never the time for advice.
Right.
Ever. It's time to just sit and listen and hold space. Right. Now, over time, over the journey, there can be some guidance and some sharing, but in immediacy, you just make space. Because we don't know how one another is experiencing grief. But again, the bottom line here is this, is that we all are experiencing grief. We all are. We're all carrying it. We all are processing through it. Pastor Rich Villodas says it like this. He says, the question is not, are you grieving? The question is your grieving bringing you closer to God or further into bondage? Okay, so the question isn't if you're grieving or not. The question is your grieving bringing you closer to God or further into bondage? And he goes on in his teaching on grief to share that grief, and unhealed grief, manifests itself in bondage and addiction. And I deeply believe this to be true. One of the underpinnings of most of our addiction, our bondage, our cycles of self-harm is almost exclusively rooted in grief of some kind.
Wow.
Now, it's diverse, again, it's unique, but it almost always falls into a rootedness of grief. So this is kind of in short what the process of grief looks like, okay? We experience loss of some kind. And again, this loss could be one of a million things. We could lose money, we could lose a family member, we could lose a sense of our identity, we could lose our call, like what we felt like was our calling in life, right? We had a plan and then the plan changed. That's loss. You could lose a pet, you could lose an opportunity, but we experience loss of some kind. And then when we lose something, after that what happens is there's pain. When we lose something good, we experience pain. It's just the law of nature. There's no way to escape it. You lose something, you experience pain. And when we experience pain, what this does is this brings us to an inflection point. This brings us to a place where we must make a decision. When we experience loss and then pain, we typically do one of two things. We either try to relieve the pain, or we try and replace whatever was lost. Okay, so hear that again. We either try to relieve the pain, or we try and replace what was lost. So here's a couple examples here. Right, relief would look like turning to drugs, turning to food, turning to pornography, turning to an over focus on exercise and television. We're trying to simply just relieve the pain. And mind you, there's no judgment here for that. Like, of course you want to relieve your pain. I participate in that all the time. Like the general instinct is always to just simply relieve the pain. But to simply relieve your pain does nothing to heal it or to fix it. If anything, to exclusively relieve your pain only lets it get worse. So to simply just relieve it for a little bit, that's kind of just like saying, okay, I have a broken arm and I'm just gonna take ibuprofen. And that's it. I'm just gonna relieve it. It's not going to hurt so bad, but we're not going to reset the bone. We're not going to put a cast on it. We're not going to do physical therapy. We're only going to try and ignore it and relieve it. Right? Or it's like, you know what? Like there's mold in the house and it stinks. So we're going to put an air freshener in the house so I don't smell the mold. That just relieves the smell, but it doesn't actually heal or fix anything. Does that make sense? So when we simply just try to relieve our pain, nothing gets healed. The other instinct we have when we lose something and then we experience pain is we try and replace that which was lost. And again, that's a natural instinct. There's no judgment here for that. Right? So we lose a relationship and then all we do is hyper focus on getting another one. Wow. Right? We lose work and then our entire identity becomes in career building and building work without ever considering maybe why we lost our job or some of the other rooted things underneath the reason why we lost it. We just become so hyper-focused on replacing that which was lost. But what I'd like to consider today is that when we entirely focus on simply replacing that which was lost, it doesn't honor that which was lost. Okay. The things that we've lost in our life deserve to be grieved. They don't deserve to be replaced. For example, one of the things that we often do, and this is really prominent, I think, in this community, right? We've been in situations or seasons where there was nobody to help us in our greatest time of need. Nobody helped us. And so then we simply try and replace that void and that hole in our soul by overcommitting and helping other people to the point of, again, simply trying to replace what was lost. It's not bad to help other people. But to do that as a means of replacing the wound rather than healing the wound will never get us to the place where we need to go. To simply replace that which was lost doesn't honor that which was lost. The people who don't try to do this most of the time are couples who have had a miscarriage. People who have had a miscarriage, they don't try to replace that which was lost because it's not honoring to the child that was lost. You see, simply just trying to replace that which was lost doesn't honor what was lost. We have to honor it. We have to pay attention to it. We have to grieve the situation, not just try and replace it. So when we experience loss and then we experience pain, our two natural instincts are to relieve it or to replace it. But tonight, my friends, what I would like to suggest is that God does not simply want to relieve your pain. God does not simply want to replace your pain, but God wants to redeem your pain. And that those are different things. That God doesn't simply want to relieve your pain, replace your pain. He wants to redeem it. And I believe it's through the process of grief where we're letting God redeem it rather than trying to replace it or relieve it, that we'll be led closer to God and away from bondage and addiction. If you would, turn to Romans chapter 8. We doing all right? This is heavy stuff, I know. Romans chapter 8, verse 18 starts like this. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. Romans 8:18. I consider that the sufferings of this present moment and time are not worth comparing to the glory about to be revealed to us. What Paul is saying here is that our present pain is nothing compared to the coming glory. That our present pain, the pain that we're feeling as a result of our loss, is nothing compared to what's coming. This is what it means when I say that God wants to redeem our pain. That there's a coming glory, there's a redemption, there's a newness that is being forged in the fires of grief that will build and make something new. But notice that Paul here doesn't say you have to believe that the coming glory is going to happen. He's simply asking you to consider that it might. Because the reality is when we're going through grief, it's so overwhelming. It's so paralyzing. The thought that we would have to fully buy into or fully believe that it could get better isn't realistic at all. I can't imagine that all the times that Paul was in difficult situations, that his instinct was just quickly to believe that it was all going to work out. There had to have been times where he doubted it a little bit. I know that's the case for me. And I would suspect that's the case for you. At least that's what you all share with me when you're in my office. Tyler, sure, I kind of think that it might get better, but right now the pain is just too overwhelming. I don't think it can get better. But some of us hold ourselves in bondage having to fully believe that it's going to get better. But what it says here in verse 18 says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing. I think that word consider is wildly liberating in seasons of grief. What if we don't have to actually believe it all the way? What if we just simply considered it? What if things could get better? What if it might be happier someday? What if I might find freedom? What if I just might? Last week, our guest speaker talked about how often we give despair way more chances than we give hope. The one time hope lets us down, we don't give it any more chances. We give hope the least amount of chances of anything. But here Paul is saying you don't even have to really believe. Just consider it. Could it be that might be the first step for some of us tonight? I'm not asking you to do anything big. I'm not even asking you to believe that it might get better. You don't have to write it in your journal. You don't have to get a tattoo. You don't have to. What if you just thought, maybe it could? No, it won't. That's a consideration. What if there was just a little seed planted, just a little bit of light that was let in? What if the pressure was taken away that you had to believe and simply you had permission to simply consider? Consider that the redemption might be on its way. Consider that there might be hope on the horizon. Consider that God might redeem that which was lost.
Wow, come on.
And then Paul starts to talk about, after this, he starts to talk about creation in the rest of the passage. And tonight I'd like to suggest that creation might be our best teacher when it comes to the way in which we are to process and go through grief. Creation might be the best example of how to journey through grief, especially in the way that God intends. Verse 19 through 21, it goes like this. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So let's consider here kind of what this passage is talking about and what it really means. You see, creation started in Eden like everything else. And in Eden, upon creation, there was no death, there was no pain. there was life, there was abundance, there was beauty. It was all good and holy. And then tragedy struck. Adam and Eve eat the apple. Shame enters into the story. Death and pain enter into the narrative. Until Adam and Eve had the apple, there was no death in Eden. You know, it wasn't the tree's fault that Adam and Eve ate the apple. It wasn't their fault. And yet, now Eden was subject to the consequences of the actions of Adam and Eve. Could it be that some of the things you're going through isn't entirely your fault? That some of the grief, some of the generational trauma, some of the narratives that you replay in your head weren't things that you simply inflicted on yourself? The ways in which you've been taught to deal with your pain isn't all something you just made up? Could it be that some of it was given to you? That in the same way as the trees, not all of the death in their life was their fault. To hold that might be one of the biggest steps for you to start moving towards freedom. Now again, I'm not relieving us of some of the decisions we've made. Those too have consequences. But much of the internal grief we carry are because of things that have been inflicted upon us outside of our control. Now, what's interesting here is that death enters into the story of creation. And what Paul shares here in these verses is that creation is looking forward. Creation is looking toward the redemption. Creation is looking forward to the children of God to be revealed. And what's interesting here is when it says that, okay, creation is looking forward. Our present suffering is nothing compared to the future glory. And creation is looking for that glory to be revealed. That word revealed is really important. What that means is that creation also hasn't seen what's going to be revealed yet. It's going to be revealed. It hasn't been seen. Creation could be looking backward to Eden. And this is what most of us do. This is, remember I talked about replacement? This is what a lot of us do. Well, I just wish it could be like it was. We're always looking back. The trees and the plants and the animals could have been saying, and they could be saying now, like, can't I just go back to Eden? Can't I just go back to the way it was? I'm grieving how it is now. I just want to go back to how it was. But this is just replacing that which was lost. Creation is grieving what it had in Eden.
Wow.
And it could be going back to long for that backwards. But in the scripture, Paul says that creation is looking forward to the future glory. Creation itself knows that God is not looking to replace that which was lost, but that God will someday create something new. This is in the scriptures what we read about later on. This is what's called the new heavens and the new earth. That God will create and build something new. And I believe in the same way that creation is looking forward. It's not looking back, it's looking forward because it knows that God is going to redeem that which was lost. The same is said for us as well. That moving forward, God is going to create something new. That we don't have to go and replace that which was lost, but rather we must set our faces forward, our hearts forward. This is why it's so important that we consider there might be redemption, so that we may move forward to the new creation that God is building for us. Now you can say, Tyler, that's really cool, but like right now, really sucks. I'm still carrying so much. I don't know how to get through this. And I want to caution us here because the temptation to long for the new heaven and the new earth is not an excuse to shy away from our present pain. Again, that's like that kind of relief thing. So some of us could be people that say, oh, I know God's just going to take care of it all. I know it's all going to be redeemed. I know, yeah, we can long for it. But if we long for it to this place where we actually don't pay attention to our present pain, we don't go through our pain, we also won't go through the healing and the process that takes us to the new heaven and the new earth, the redemption in our story. So to long for the new heaven and the new earth does not take away our present pain, and it's not a command to take away and to not pay attention to it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Four years ago, my mom died after a lifetime of sickness. I grew up, like I'd be watching baseball games, and then my mom's like little timer would go off, and we'd have to go in, and she'd have this big wound in her stomach, and we'd have to like take out the gauze and clean out the infection and like bandage up her stomach, and I could like see her intestines, and it was like in my living room. I've had like my birthday and Christmas in the ICU, and and I had never grieved any of it. I honestly thought that like most kids knew how to do that kind of stuff. That it wasn't unusual to just like think, okay, like mom might die this weekend during her surgery, like, and it just is kind of part of the language we had as a family. And I carried this grief all this time. And again, note what grief looks like. My mom hadn't died for most of my life at that point. And yet because she was so sick, I lost a lot. Right? I lost a mother in the way that I should have had one. I lost innocence. Like I knew my mom's body in ways that like a child shouldn't know, right? Taking care of her in her sickness. I lost innocence. So again, there wasn't death, but there still was loss. Does that make sense?
Right.
In which case I was carrying more grief. But I didn't know it was grief. I didn't have language for it. And so my whole life, I packed it in. I didn't feel it. I didn't experience it. I didn't go through it. And then there was just this morning, I woke up, and I thought it was like a Tuesday. And so I started getting ready for work, and my wife was like, yo, dude, it's Sunday. It's not a work day. And I didn't know that because I had been sleeping for like 8 days straight. I just didn't get out of bed. My body had just turned off. And she like walked me to the bathroom a few times and was like dripping water into my mouth. But I couldn't get out of bed. And long story short, I went to my pastor's house at the time, and I talked to him for a long time, and then he finally stopped me and he said, Tyler, have you ever cried about your mom being sick before? And I hadn't. In fact, at that point, I don't know if I had ever cried in my entire life. And so what he did was he said, Tyler, I need you to lay on the couch. And we were just at his house. And his wife was like in the next room making breakfast or whatever. And then he laid on the floor next to me. Like I was on the couch, he was on the floor. And he started crying. My pastor did. He just started weeping and weeping and weeping. And it was super awkward, because I was just laying there. I was like, okay, like what the hell is going on now? But then there was like this moment when I found my tears that have been hiding deep in my soul for such a long time. I didn't know that I had lost a mom my whole life. Before she died, I had already lost her. I didn't know that my childhood was robbed. I didn't know. But you see, what Daniel didn't do at that moment was he didn't just say, okay, Tyler, it's all going to get better. We're just going to addict ourselves to the future hope. He said, no, in order for us to get to the new heaven and the new earth, in order for us to get to the new pain, we have, or the new life, the new redemption, we have to sit in the current pain.
Right.
We have to pay attention to our current suffering so that we can make our way to the future glory. And I sat there on the floor and I cried for 2 or 3 hours. I can't even remember. And long story short, and then after that, I started going to therapy. And after therapy, I went to rehab. And then after rehab, I started getting a spiritual director. And then after that, I end up selling everything I owned. And now I get to be your boss. So that's too bad. I think you guys wish I never did my own internal work. You're stuck with me now. The point being is that when I finally started to grieve, that was the moment that my internal liberation started. That it was in the moment that I started to cry, that my pathway towards all that I've been called to be was opened. We first must recognize how much it sucks. And again, creation does this. Even as creation longs for the redemption, even as creation longs for the new heaven and the new earth, it still experiences, first of all, it experiences death every year. It goes through cycles of death and resurrection. It practices grieving. Every winter, the trees shed all their beauty. They go inside and they just sit. They don't do anything. They don't produce nothing. They ain't trying to fix anything. They're not providing shade. They just winter down. Every year, nature goes through seasons. The bears, they go into their caves, into darkness. They just struggle through harsh winter. They go through seasons of it all the time, continuing to recognize the current struggle, the current pain. The point here is that I don't have all the words or answers. Yes, I can tell you there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, that God doesn't want to simply relieve or replace your pain, that God wants to redeem it. But I don't know, I don't have all the answers of how that's going to happen. I'm not here to take away the pain you're experiencing in this moment. Grief sucks. There's too much of it. It's too complex to simply explain it all away. Sometimes all we can do is groan. Sometimes all we can do is pay attention to what's going on here in the present moment and groan. When a mother is giving birth, there are no words that anyone can say that will take away the pain. There are no words. All she can do is groan. And yet the groaning is the very thing that allows a mother to express what is going on in her body as she is giving birth to new life. Could it be that the same is said for us? That sometimes there's not particular words, there's not a formula. All we can simply do is groan while new life is being birthed in our story. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, it says in verse 22. That season on the floor of my pastor's house, I didn't have words and neither did he. We simply groaned, knowing somehow, some way there would be redemption, but right now we simply had to do was groan. I'll close with this, a quote by the great Father Richard Rohr. He says, "In the end, we do not so much reclaim what we have lost as discover a significantly new self in and through the process. Until we are led to the limits of our present game plan and find it to be insufficient, we will not search out or find the real source, the deep well, or the constantly flowing river." And so tonight, may it be that we can consider the future glory, but that also we may be courageous enough to groan and experience our current and present pain. And may that present pain be the doorway to the redemption of that which you've lost. May it be so.
Thanks for tuning in to a message from the Sanctuary Church. For more information and media, go to our website at thesanctuarywestside.org or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube.